Well, Donald Trump has dropped his great Liberation Day tariffs, shocking the world, horrifying his foes, and even a few of his friends. So guess what? We need to go through this project in depth and try and work out the good, the bad, and the ugly that goes along with this new wave of American protectionism, which either has the chance to transform the economic landscape and usher in a new American renaissance, or, if things go wrong, bring in a new Great Depression. So let me have a few ideas here about what's going on, and let's try and work out just what the plan is here. First, here's a little bit of Donald Trump announcing the tariffs.
This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence. For years, hardworking American citizens were forced to sit on the sidelines as other nations got rich and powerful, much of it at our expense.
Okay, that's good so far as it goes, but before we do anything else, let's be honest and go through some of the problems with this program. And don't worry, we're going to hit both sides of this along the way. One of the first things we have to know is that the tariffs have been calculated, it appears, in a very simplistic way. The formula by which the tariffs were calculated was, shall we say, less than economically compelling. I'll try to keep the math to a minimum, but here goes. The White House appears to have worked this out by dividing the U.S. trade deficit with each country by that country's exports to the U.S. That final reciprocal tariff number was then divided by 2 with a minimum of 10% if that number went down below that. Got it? Put simply, the U.S. trade deficit with X country divided by U.S. imports from X country divided by 2, or 2%, which, by the way, is what Australia wound up comping. And, of course, this methodology meant that there were some weird outliers. The Trump administration has put a 10% tariff on the Heard and McDonald Islands, which has a population of 0 human beings, and the only folks who live there are penguins. Now, at first glance, this looks incredibly sloppy, though there are some suggesting that even taxing those islands is a way to avoid administrative loophole chicanery. So I'll give them this, but I still don't see penguins being much use in a Chinese-owned overseas sweatshop. But you know what? We'll see. Now let's get on to the second point, though, and that is that you have to understand that the current economic American situation simply could not go on. Donald Trump was trying to short-circuit this, and what he's trying to short-circuit is essentially the endless outsourcing of production and keeping the American population mollified with cheap imported goods via shops like Walmart, having this go on while at the same time allowing the U.S. Treasury to run up massive deficits that this year were projected to require nearly $1 trillion to service. Well, you don't have to be an economist to know that all of those things aren't going to work out. You can't keep that going forever. In fact, it's not far to say that the way the American economy has been working for the past several decades has been like the old Roman Empire with bread and circuses. You know, a system created for a global elite that was increasingly unstable at home. And again, all the guys out there, if I know you think about the Roman Empire a lot. And there's a pretty good analogy that what's going on here in empire terms, well, globalism loots the center of the empire eventually, just like in Rome. Because what in the old days looked like resource extraction is today just buying cheap stuff and selling it into the voters. Meanwhile, the elite corruption of old in Rome and today is everywhere and is simply now disguised by lobbying. Just look, if you want proof of what's going on here, the vast numbers of congressmen who have suddenly become inexplicably rich. How does that work? Look at this graph here. The top 0.1% of people in America have become unbelievably wealthy in recent years. But if you look at that bottom line, the blue line, everybody else, the average American, they've been flatlining. This is how globalism doesn't work for everybody. So much of what, indeed, we have been sold in America, in Australia, around the Western world as overall GDP growth eventually starts to look like a sham driven by importing cheap goods and exporting wealth overseas, while those who are lucky enough to be in the right position get to clip the ticket. Meanwhile, the trade deficit, the U.S. trade deficit, is more than $1 trillion a year. And the shift in the nature of the American economy makes it harder and harder for the U.S. to stay as an industrialized power, which is the other thing, and I know that Donald Trump worries about this a lot, that from a security point of view, if you as a nation don't have industry, you can't defend yourself. Again, look at Australia. And beyond that, though, the overall deficit required to keep everything going, well, as I said before, they're paying $1 trillion a year just to service the interest. Again, this was all unsustainable. And there is one school of thought that, in fact, what these tariffs is all about is spooking the bond markets enough that the value of long-term treasuries come down to start to provide some relief to the U.S. taxpayer and allow America to pay off that unsustainable debt. Think of it like a great disruptive refinancing, where you have to cut spending, but you get there in the end. But again, back to basics, all up, the current economic and trade system in the U.S., up until yesterday, has really been, again, increasingly based on bread and circuses. You know, cheap stuff, let's keep it going. The elites do very well. Everyone else, well, they've got their stuff, but they're not getting rich. But again, people say, hey, look, that's still better than the alternative, isn't it? I disagree. If you look long-term, if you look long-term at history, this is a recipe for instability. It is, again, what did I say before? Bread and circuses. You think it's just a coincidence why everyone now is so into gladiator shows? I mean, UFC these days? Or that those who have done the best out of the current system are screaming the loudest about trade and changes to it because they know this might not work out for them so well? Well, that's the thing. Something had to give. And in the end, tariffs have always been a way governments have been using to adjust these imbalances. The theory goes that by spending money and investing at home rather than sending money abroad, well, you get richer, things get better for everyone. That's the theory. But again, history, let's go back, shows that's also not always the case. Remember, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 1920s are always blamed for extending the Great Depression. Though there is also a stronger case to be made that the Great Depression was made so much worse by the economic mismanagement and big spending of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who made things so much worse than they needed to be. Which brings us to Trump. Donald Trump had a number of formative business experiences in the 1980s when Japan was buying up Rockefeller Center and pretty much every big thing in the U.S. Well, the fact is, he has been talking about and been keenly aware of this problem explicitly for 35 years and saying what he thought needed to be done. Here he was on Oprah decades ago.
Last year criticizing U.S. foreign policy. What would you do differently, Donald?
I'd make our allies, forgetting about the enemies you can't talk to so easily, I'd make our allies pay their fair share. We're a debtor nation. Something's going to happen over the next number of years with this country, because you can't keep going on losing $200 billion, and yet we let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible. They come over here, they sell their cars, their VCRs, they knock the hell out of our companies. And hey, I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country.
Well, you may disagree with him, but if you think he's not genuine about the issue, good luck. And also, here's Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick just yesterday.
So what's happened to the world is the global governments have backed taking our factories away from us. I mean, there's nothing about Taiwan that they should be making semiconductors. There's nothing about Korea. They should be making all of the appliances and the electronics of the world. What's happened is they had a policy of their governments to let's back our companies and let's take this business from America while America's not paying attention. So our factories went overseas. But what you're going to see is the most modern factories of the world come back here.
And here's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent summing it up for Americans who are worried about tariffs and what to do about them to CNN.
And obviously, with the cars, all foreign-made cars, imports, are getting a 25% tariff starting at midnight. If half the cars coming into the United States are foreign-made, that's hard to turn around overnight, as you know. So what would you say to people in the auto industry who are worried about that timeline and how quickly that can shift?
Buy American.
Isn't this incredible? This is world historical stuff here. Donald Trump decades ago identified the problem. He identified what he believes to be a solution. And this week, as we've just seen here, imposed his will to implement that solution. This is major stuff. This is going to reshape the entire global economy. But still leaves the question, will the tariffs work? Or will they usher in a disaster? And I'll be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure of the answer. But I do know two things. None of this is any of a surprise. And things the way they were, well, they couldn't keep going on forever. To which I say, buckle up, kids. It's time for some history.